I'm Inc. Executive Editor Diana Ransom.
And I'm Editor-at-Large Christine Lagorio-Chafkin.
And you're listening to From the Ground Up. Today's episode, Preparing for Demand Shocks. Last week, we had a fascinating conversation with Laura Modi, who's the co-founder of baby formula company Bobbie, and Justine Tu, who's the co-founder of crochet kit company The Woobles.
And even though both of them had dealt with demand issues, they had extremely different circumstances and experiences. That left us wondering, there is such a range of shocks that can happen to your supply chain and to the demand for what you're making. Can you ever truly prepare? What kinds of projections are most useful? And how can you set yourself up for success if you do have the ability to anticipate a surge in demand?
So we decided to ask someone who has worked with many companies, large and small, to make their supply chains more diversified and flexible.
She's also something of a supply chain influencer. The LinkedIn variety, not the TikTok variety. She's Lisa Anderson, who is the president of LMA Consulting Group.
Oh, now I'm intrigued. A supply chain influencer? Let's hear more.
We all know that supply chains are inherently complicated. There are lots of different things that can break and cause major problems for a company. But what we want to talk about today is, in specific, something that isn't just a piece of the supply chain breaking, but rather what happens when a company has a sudden surge in demand and how they can respond. What are your big thoughts there about, say it's a small company that all of a sudden has their first really big order and needs to either scale up or just think differently about how they are doing their supply chain?
Well, that is one of the largest challenges, especially since the pandemic. Volumes have been really high. So, there's many strategies you can follow, but for your first foray into this situation, I would definitely say, run overtime. It's definitely the easiest, quickest way to solve a surge in demand. Of course, it depends on how big, but basically that's a good place to start.
So wherever you are getting your parts, your complete product from, get that factory running 24/7 if you can.
Exactly.
And what about from your team level? Like, how can you motivate your folks to kind of get everything moving really quickly? And then how do you think about scaling up your actual process?
I mean, it sounds somewhat like uncommon common sense, but share what's happening, share your vision for where you're going, what you're expecting in terms of sales. And then if folks have a weekly goal or even a daily goal, I've seen some clients, they ring bells and do fun things when they meet and exceed their goals. So certainly a spike in demand would be worthy of something like that. And when you do that, everybody is like understanding, they're on the page, they're thinking about, what is this company about? How do they deliver value to their customers? And how can they be a part of it? Who doesn't want to be a part of something that's exciting and successful? So really the best way to get them involved is to involve them and have them understand how this is helping their customers, how this is helping end users. It depends on what, the products are involved. And so that it's a good way to get folks on the page and understanding what they need to do to pull together and help overcome this obstacle.
This seems like a problem that, not uniquely, but oftentimes hits very small teams, startups that are just getting off the ground. Maybe they have just a handful of employees. So one of the companies that we spoke to last week is called The Woobles. They make little crochet kits, and they were just meeting their first big surge in demand. They had something of a Black Friday sale, and they had a bunch of orders coming in. They had a bunch of product coming in, and that bunch of product that came in was defective. So they were hit by a double sort of crunch, and it was a partially handmade good to begin with. The crochet kit had like a starter loop going on, and they ended up having to do that by themselves and bringing in family members, bringing in everyone they could to sort of remake the product. In fact, this happened to them, again and again. There were different products down the line that had different flaws when being shipped from overseas. How is the company to think about that? I mean, for me, that brings up like, okay, well, there maybe should have been some better prototyping done or some better testing done. But let's kind of back up and talk about how to build that very initial supply chain where maybe you're just starting up. You don't have all the budget to have redundancy at every point in your supply chain or a diversity of different manufacturers. You're relying on maybe one factory or two. How can you think about building that in the most kind of cost-effective and reliable fashion?
what they did is exactly the way you want to do it, because you want to bring on additional resources as quickly as possible and get them to fill in gaps. It's a little bit of a catch-22, but you have to be really careful about who your suppliers are and if they're going to come through, what type of quality protocols they put in place. So I would definitely recommend certainly sending in samples, doing some test shipments. Generally speaking, it's easier to do a sample run than it is to do like a higher volume run. So really, before you commit to anything with a supplier, it's a good idea to not just do samples, but to do like a higher volume run and to build into your contracts what happens if there's quality issues, especially if you're getting it from overseas. More and more, they're having struggles in the various areas they're in. And so I would definitely say another question to ask them up front is, what is their ability to scale up? Can they increase volume by 10%, 20%, 100%? And in what time frame, right? Because of course, most suppliers will say, sure, I can increase it. But what does that mean? Like, does it take 6 months for them to scale up, or do they have some excess capacity? So I would find out, what can you do within a short period of time? Like, I don't know, a month or less. And what could you do in a longer period of time? And what does that mean in terms of the percentages of increased business? Now, depending upon your situation, if you're starting off with small volumes, you may not have any sort of volume discount. So you might also want to say, as we get to these increased levels, we're building in some volume discounts. But again, remember that none of those matter if you don't have something built in for, the percent of quality products received, and that you have backup sources to get your products from point A to point B. Because if it's coming from overseas, there's plenty of challenges that have come up in the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the pandemic earlier, and that consumer awareness of the supply chain, the global supply chain, really went from almost nothing to, being exposed to front page news every day about the supply chain.
Many stores still have limits on how much you can buy of a certain product, like toilet paper.
Can't find lumber to build a new home? Well, you can't find products to stock the shelves of your small business. Can't find holiday gifts.
Some of these companies are using this dock space just like a warehouse and can't move their product.
How has that affected you and your work? Do you just see more consumer awareness, or have you, as sort of a supply chain advisor and influencer, gotten more work out of this?
It is kind of funny because certainly the business folks I was dealing with before were aware of what supply chain was, but it certainly has become, broadly recognized. So I would definitely say that from a media point of view, there's been a lot more interest in supply chain, what's happening, as they realize really how important it really is. I mean, when it's all running smoothly, it's a complex system and it seems like, great, I'm not going to worry about it because it's just going to keep running smoothly. But there are so many pieces and parts. And as we've gone global in our supply chains, there's many, many more risks than there used to be. So it's really important to, you don't have to become a supply chain expert, but you need to know the basics and bring in experts when you run across more complex situations so that you can set yourself up for success so you can scale up when you need to.
Right. I mean, there are plenty of companies these days that will even manage your whole supply chain for you, right?
Absolutely true.
Yeah. But I do think one thing that small companies need to know is kind of those projections, to be able to look to the future, right? And say, here's our capacity now and here's where we want to go. We talk to founders all the time, and one thing that oftentimes can break a company or almost break it is kind of when they get their first big deal with a major retailer, say a Target or Costco, and all of a sudden they have a huge order, and maybe there's an expectation of future orders, maybe there's not, right? And they don't know exactly how to project beyond that point, and the margins are tighter than they're used to. Do you have any advice for companies going through something like that?
Yeah, one of the areas that focus on from a supply chain point of view is sales forecasting and trying to predict volumes. Is the definition is that you're always going to be 100% wrong if you need to do it in detail by product, by month. I mean, that's normal. However, you want to be directionally correct. Who are your target markets? Who are your target consumers if you're going to consumers? Maybe there are groups of them. And what do you think would be the most that would happen and the least amount that would, what's your minimum, what's your maximum for each group? And then, if you have a Target or a Walmart in your mix, the definition of dealing with them is that you're going to have to be more savvy, and that you're going to get what's considered a large order to you. Maybe not a large order to them for sure, but a large order to you. So you're going to need to definitely plan for how would you scale up to an initial order with one of the big box stores early on, and predict what that might be. Ask somebody in your industry, ask the companies you're working with. They should be able to give you a ballpark idea so that you can go back into your supply chain and plan for the appropriate manufacturing, logistics, people on your side, etc.
Yeah, that's great advice. And have you encountered other companies that had interesting or interesting case studies of having that sudden surge in demand and having to react quickly to it?
Yes. Actually, almost every client had that unplanned for surge in demand somewhere during the pandemic, because, they may have panicked at first, but then they realize, oh, people still eat. So I need to supply chocolates or whatever.
Right. Maybe through a slightly different route than they used to. Maybe not through restaurants, but through...
It's true. Different channels.
Yeah.
So really, the larger clients would, generally speaking, run overtime, bring temporary employees on hand. When they originally had the decrease in volume, which happened largely across the board, they didn't immediately let everybody go, because that's the hardest thing is to find qualified people. So they would let go of their temporary employees first because they're not actually employees. And then they looked at how can I automate some of what I'm doing so that when volume does come on, I can actually utilize some of this automation, advanced technologies to scale up even quicker.
Great. Are there any clients you can name or any companies that you didn't work with that you've seen interesting things from that you can talk about in specific?
Well, I did work with one of the food companies was a food bar manufacturer, and what I was describing is what we did. Also worked with an industrial equipment manufacturer, and in their case, they manufacture most of their products in the US. And so they had to pursue offload capability. And what that means is they took core products within their product line that they thought that they could provide specs on pretty quickly, that they could find suppliers that could ramp up and help support and supplement their volume. So in essence, if you're somebody who outsources all of your manufacturing, it would be like finding a backup supplier. So it's similar in nature. Mm-hmm. So they ended up finding overflow volume, and that helped them so that they actually could meet their demand, and they were able to grow. They actually doubled their business since the pandemic. By supplementing with overflow, they also pursued some of the efficiency and automation, robotics that I was talking about earlier. So they did all of the above. And then now their volume is still strong, but they're actually able to reduce temps and better utilize the people that they have so that they can meet the ongoing volume, but at a higher profit margin.
So just make sure to continue to utilize your highly skilled workers the best you can.
Exactly. That is the bottom line. For the foreseeable future, the next 10, 20 years, you're going to have a diversified supply chain if you want to be in business long term. Spikes in demand are going to become the norm. When I was with Paper Pack, they make adult incontinence products, and we diversified our supply chain. One of our core materials was produced in Brazil. They were lower cost. They were reliable. But we put it on an extra supplier in the US that they cost at least 20% more, which did not make our board members happy at all, because they were concerned about the profit impact. Because having a backup supplier alone does not satisfy the need, because they won't come on board when you need them. You have to actually buy from them. So we had to buy 20% of our volume from this backup supplier. And then once of course, there was a problem that came up. I think it was related to the ports, and we couldn't get anything from our Brazil supplier. We would have had to shut down our lines, which, talking about the value of products, it's not good if your grandmother can't receive an adult diaper, right, when she needs one. So basically, our U.S. supplier, though, cranked up and was able to supply us. And our competition, of course, asked them as well, but they didn't supply them because they weren't purchasing from them all along. So supplier diversity is going to be a critical topic.
You mentioned that the future is going to need to be full of redundancy for founders in their supply chain, that the world is changing quickly. Businesses are opening and closing domestically, internationally too. What else should we be thinking about the state of the supply chain globally right now and what founders should know?
It is, at the high level, it's definitely in transition, to say the least. There's a lot of challenges. So just looking at the global supply chain, we have the Panama Canal, which is a major gateway from Northeast Asia to coming to the East Coast of the U.S. 40% of those goods pass through there. It's been experiencing a drought.
Is this the world's most expensive traffic jam? Ships lined up for days outside the Panama Canal last August.
And so really the capacity has gone down by about 50%, which means higher prices, challenges. So folks went from there, they could instead go through the Suez Canal. So you go from Northeast Asia through the Suez Canal to the eastern side of the U.S. However, the Houthi rebels have been attacking ships.
But now it's deadly serious. This, one of two occasions we witnessed when the Houthis fire ballistic missiles, traveling at more than 3 times the speed of sound.
So that's a problem. So they couldn't go through the Suez Canal anymore. They had to go around the southern tip of Africa, which adds 10 days to the trip and a bunch of money and problems. Then, of course, we had the Baltimore bridge collapse.
A large container ship hit a column of the bridge just after 1:30 Eastern this morning, and a massive portion of the bridge fell into the water, along with several vehicles.
It was sort of like the last straw for some clients. And so now they're actually going from Northeast Asia to the west coast of the U.S., and then they're going to rail from there to the east coast of the U.S. So you have to have a backup to your backup, but these are just commonplace problems in today's world. You need to plan for resiliency, and more folks are going to a regional supply chain so that they're trying to limit their exposure, which maybe higher prices up front. However, it could very much be a good idea to pursue actually a supply chain in the U.S. and certainly Mexico. Mexico's labor rates are actually lower than China's. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I've spoken over the last couple of years to a few different founders who have built in that U.S. factories or U.S. suppliers, and no one has been unhappy about it that I've spoken to, despite the higher costs. So yeah, great advice. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Lisa.
Oh, great. It was fun to be here.
That's all for today's episode of From the Ground Up.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice. Also, if you liked today's episode and you have suggestions on what topics you'd like to hear about, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or reach out to us on Inc.'s social channels on LinkedIn, X, or Instagram.
From the Ground Up is produced by Julia Shu, Blake Odom, and Avery Miles. Mix and sound design by Nicholas Torres. Our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.